Good evening to everyone, and hello from Jerusalem. My name is Samuel Thrope, and I'm the content manager for the Maktoub Digitization project here at the National Library of Israel. Supported by the Arcadia Fund, Maktoub is a project that's going to provide free global access to more than 2,500 rare Arabic, Persian, and Turkish manuscripts and books preserved here at the library, and also access to the stories behind their creation. That's part of what we're doing tonight. We're very happy for their support. So let's begin. We are now today just coming towards the end of this year's Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, and it has been a very strange Hajj indeed. Because of the global coronavirus pandemic, foreign visitors, who usually number in the millions, have been banned from the week-long event. Only 1,000 residents of Saudi Arabia were allowed to come to Mecca to perform the Hajj this year, and then only if they maintain the proper social distancing. It's the same in Mecca as it is anywhere else in the world these days. While the pilgrimage has been impacted by war and by disease before, this is actually the first time that there's been such a disruption since the founding of the Saudi Kingdom in 1932. So, given the fact that so many Muslims are so very far from Mecca this year, I wanted to take the time we have today to talk about the meaning of the Hajj through the prism of two Sufi tales. Both stories, one is fictional, and the other, let's call it autobiography, but we'll think more about what that means a little bit later. Both stories ask the question of which is the true pilgrimage, the physical journey to Mecca or a spiritual journey to the Kaaba of the heart. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to explore these stories together with you, and I'll be very happy and curious to hear your questions and your impressions at the end of the talk. So to begin, and before we actually turn to the stories themselves, I want to take a moment for us just to remind ourselves what the Hajj pilgrimage is, in a normal year at any rate. For some of you, I'm sure this will be a little bit repetitious, maybe well-traveled territory, but please bear with me. I think that understanding the scope and significance of the physical pilgrimage as it's practiced historically and today will help us better uncover its mystical dimensions. So the Hajj begins every year on the 8th day of the Islamic month of Dhul al-Hijjah, and millions of visitors, as I mentioned, come annually to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Every able-bodied Muslim who has the financial means is obligated to perform the Hajj at least once in his or her lifetime. The Hajj rituals, which take place over the course of 5 or 6 days, depending on the year, they follow a prescribed order. Having entered a state of ritual purity, known as ihram, male pilgrims put on a white garment, and men and women both refrain from cutting their hair and their nails, hunting, and a list of other activities that are deemed impure during the entire Hajj season, or the period. Pilgrims, the first thing they do is circumambulate. They walk around the Kaaba, and the Kaaba is the black draped square building that's located inside the Grand Mosque. I'll show you an image in a second. Now, this ritual of circumambulation, which happens 7 times, is known as tawaf in Arabic. Set in a corner of the Kaaba is a sacred black stone that tradition states was brought down from heaven by the angel Gabriel. Pilgrims then pray in the mosque and drink water from the Zamzam well located there. And following that, they run or walk sa'i, a ritual known as sa'i, back and forth 7 times between the adjoining hills.
I'm sorry, excuse me, Samuel?
Yeah.
You're not sharing the image that you were trying to share? Are you trying to share something?
No, I'm going to share it in a second.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, thank you.
No, it's okay. Thank you for asking. Yeah, we're going to get to the image just in a minute. Other central Hajj rituals include wukuf, standing before God on the plain of Arafat, which is located some 20 kilometers east of Mecca, which is a contemplative practice of listening to sermons, prayer, and atonement. Pilgrims also throw pebbles at 3 pillars representing the devil on the nearby plain of Mina. And following the ritual stoning, animals are sacrificed. Today, often people buy a voucher for the sacrifice rather than performing it themselves, and the meat is donated to the poor. On that very same day, Muslims the world over also sacrifice animals as part of the Eid al-Adha holiday, which began just this past Thursday. Now, obviously, the pilgrimage to Mecca was and remains a central part of the religious life of Muslims the world over. And that centrality also found expression in art. So here I'm going to move in 1 second to the PowerPoint, and we'll be sort of jumping back and forth over the course of the lecture. Just a second. There we go. Right. Yes, so this is the image that I mentioned before. There's a picture, a contemporary picture of the Kaaba in the middle. This is the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the white-clad pilgrims circling around the mosque. And one of, traditionally, and by traditionally I mean in pre-modern times when there were fewer pilgrims than those you see here, every time you went around the Kaaba, you were supposed to touch the black stone that's set in its side. Now, because there's so many people, you generally point towards it rather than touching it. So that's what it looks like today. And this image, or illustration rather, is taken from a 17th century manuscript called the Manasik al-Hajj, a Turkish poem, Turkish devotional poem about the Hajj, about the Hajj rituals. And every other page almost is illustrated with an image such as we find here. Here again is the Kaaba in black, the Grand Mosque surrounding. The different small structures are dedicated to the 4 different schools of Islamic legal jurisprudence. And this green one right here in the center, for those of you who can read Arabic, you can see it says Maqam Ibrahim. This is actually the place of Abraham. And inside is a stone on which tradition states there's the prophet, or the patriarch's footprint has been imprinted as if he was standing on it. Here is another image from the same manuscript in the National Library of Israel collection, of course, showing Safa above and Marwa below. Now, these illustrations are obviously not architectural diagrams, right? They're not meant to give us a realistic sense of what Mecca looked like in the mid-17th century. But in a way, they give us a better sense of what it did look like than perhaps contemporary photos do. So I'll show you a couple of those now. Here is Mecca as of a few years ago. An aerial view in here, the very small black square is the Kaaba, around it pilgrims circling is the mosque. But what catches the eye in this image, obviously, is the giant 5 or 6 tower hotel complex, which overshadows the mosque, the construction cranes. This is what Mecca looks like today. And here's an image of Safa and Marwa, which has been entirely enclosed. Even the hills, the rocks themselves are now within 4 walls at this point. I should say that these improvements and changes have actually made the pilgrimage a lot safer and more accessible for pilgrims of all ages and people coming from all over the world, but in millions, as we said. There's even a special lane dedicated in the middle of the route between Safa and Marwa for people who are handicapped or elderly, infirm to go at their own place. Now, the Hajj rituals are incredibly ancient, and they actually long predate the Prophet Muhammad, and go back to someone with whom I'm sure we're all familiar. Here in this little medallion in the corner is an image of Abraham, patriarch Abraham, whom I just mentioned. It's from an 18th century copy of the genealogy and cosmology known as the Ajaib al-Makhluqat. Now, Abraham's, and here I'm going to exit the PowerPoint. Abraham's association with the Hajj is something that goes back long to pre-antiquity. And there are a number of different aspects to it. Commentators have relayed a number of versions of how Abraham's footprint became embedded in the stone, Maqam Ibrahim, which I mentioned. Some say he stood on the stone when he was building the upper walls of the Kaaba. Some say he stood there when calling on all humanity to perform the pilgrimage, or that Abraham himself prayed at the stone. Similarly, a story that is probably familiar to all of us, the story of Abraham's handmaiden Hagar, is closely connected to the Hajj as well. According to the eminent medieval historian Al-Tabari, after Sarah forced out Hagar and Ishmael, Hagar and Abraham's son, the angel Gabriel directed Abraham to lead them to the future site of the Kaaba, which was then a barren hill of clay. After Abraham left the mother and her infant son behind, Ishmael became thirsty, but there was no water to be found. Desperate, Hagar thought she heard the sound of water on the nearby hill of Safa. She ran there and found nothing. She thought she heard the sound on the hill of Marwa too, and ran there and found nothing. After running back and forth between the hills over and over again, she came back to Ishmael and found him sitting in a puddle of water that had miraculously burst forth from an underground spring. This story, which is told in other versions as well, is meant to explain the rituals of Sa'i, and that is the running between Safa and Marwa, and drinking the waters of the Zamzam spring. And similarly, the last Abraham connection I want to bring up is the animal sacrifice on Eid al-Adha, which commemorates Abraham's narrowly averted sacrifice of his own son, familiar from the book of Genesis as the Aqidah, or binding of Isaac. While the Quranic narrative doesn't specify which son, Isaac or Ishmael, was the chosen sacrifice, later commentators and compilers generally agree that he was Ishmael, the ancestor of Muhammad. Now, the Hajj is closely linked to the Prophet Muhammad himself also, of course. While Mecca was an important pilgrimage center throughout antiquity, where the idols of numerous gods and goddesses were worshipped, Muhammad sanctified, or, in light of what we now know about Abraham, re-sanctified the holy site for Islam. A native of the city, he and his followers were forced to flee to nearby Medina in 622, when his prophecy raised the ire of leading citizens and they plotted to murder him. When Muhammad returned triumphantly to Mecca, now as its ruler in 630, just before his death, he himself established the ritual sequence of Tawaf, Sa'i, Arafat, etc., that pilgrims follow until today. Now, part of the reason I think that the Hajj experience is so powerful for so many is because it reverberates precisely through all these different layers, from Abraham to Muhammad, to pilgrims' own memories of hearing stories and seeing images like the ones that we saw of Mecca from the time that they were children. Now, all that background, and thank you for staying with me while we did cover it, I think it was important. That leads us to the first story that I'd like to be the focus of our discussion today. The story comes from 13th century mystic and philosopher Jalal al-Din Rumi's poetic masterpiece, the Masnavi-e Manavi, the spiritual couplets. And here I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint for a second and share with you an image of that manuscript, the page in a manuscript from the library's collection of the Masnavi, where the story appears. Now, here is the story, and it goes like this. So there was once a young Sufi initiate whose name was Bayezid, who left his home in northeastern Iran to accomplish and perform the pilgrimage to Mecca, a 2,500 kilometer journey. So he leaves his home, and every town and village that he visits along the way on his journey towards Mecca, he stops and sees if he can meet the local Sufi master, the local spiritual authority. He's seeking guidance, he's seeking a teacher, he's seeking someone to provide him direction in his life. In one town, and we don't know the name of it actually, he comes upon a master who says something very curious to him. An old hunched man, an old, clearly ancient Sufi, who asks Bayezid, so where are you going? What are you doing? Bayezid says, I'm going to Mecca, I'm going to the Kaaba to perform the Hajj. And this old man says, forget the Kaaba, just walk around me 7 times instead. Now here we have the text before us, and this is quoted from the translation of Rumi by Joeid Mujahidi. Complete your Hajj thus. Reached your journey's end. This is what the old man tells him. You've run to Safa, entered purity. You've done the Umrah, live eternally. He judges me much loftier, I swear, than that mere house of his. Let us compare. The Kaaba is the home of piety, but I contain his deepest mystery. Inside the Kaaba, no one's ever stepped, and my pure heart, none but God will accept. When you have seen me, you have seen God too. You'll circle then the Kaaba that's most true. To serve me is obeying God's decree. So don't suppose he is separate from me. Open your inner eye and see if you can perceive the light inside a man. So hearing the old man's words, the mystic truth pierced into Bayezid, Rumi tells us, and he reached his journey's end, though that end was enlightenment, not his original goal of Mecca. Now, the arc of the story, and I'm just going to leave up the text for a minute or two so you can follow along and read it. The arc of the story is pretty clear, I think. Bayezid sets off, he thinks, to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca, and along the way to meet a guide who will help him on the Sufi path. But there's no implication, really, that this Sufi master is going to give him any instruction beyond the ordinary. However, Bayezid is surprised. When the meeting with his true master actually occurs, he realizes that his priorities are all wrong. The physical pilgrimage to the Kaaba, the house of God, takes second place. It's this mystical encounter with a man whose pure heart is the Kaaba that's even more true and real. With the central importance of the Hajj, which exactly what everything that we discussed before in mind, the story of Bayezid and the old man seems very surprising. Even to the point, I think, perhaps we dare say it, of being a little blasphemous. Is circling this sheikh, this old man, really equivalent? Is it really preferable to circling the Kaaba? Is it preferable to going on the Hajj? What does this story mean? I'm going to close it and just go back to me. Now, there are a number of important points about this story. And the first one I want to touch on is, and that I think we need to keep in mind, is that the Bayezid of Rumi's story is actually himself a well-known historical figure, an influential and controversial Sufi master in his own right, who died in the second half of the 9th century CE, actually quite early in the history of Sufism and the history of Islam overall, right? The Prophet Muhammad was only a 7th century figure. We don't know very much about this historical Bayezid's life. And that's partly because he was a recluse. He was solitary. He didn't leave any written work behind. But his bold, ecstatic sayings have been preserved. His fame, in fact, rests on those sayings. And they're statements that can strike readers today. Many of us who have, preconceived notions of Islam as conservative, strict, and legalistic, they can strike us as surprising as the old man's instructions in Rumi's story. The central theme of many of Bayezid's sayings is his equating himself with God, or even surpassing God in greatness. He's reported to have said, "Glory be to me! How great is my majesty!" He called for the direction of prayer, which normally Muslims pray toward Mecca, they pray toward the Kaaba. He said the direction of prayer should be turned to face him instead. He declared that the Kaaba circles him, it circumambulates him rather than the other way around. And he replied to the muezzin's call to prayer of "God is great" with the answer, "I am greater." Finally, he said, "There is no God but I, so worship me," which is a reversal, 100% reversal of the Muslim creed, "There is no God but God." Now, it's important to realize that Bayezid's statements are not a sign of madness or nihilistic atheism. Instead, what he was trying to do was to express the experience of his individual consciousness, right? His individual self and personality becoming truly and completely obliterated in the divine. Now, that turns out, really a kind of a radical expression of a central Islamic concept, the concept of Tawheed, divine unity or oneness. From a theological standpoint, Tawheed means monotheism. God is one, there's one true God, and there are no others. But for Islamic philosophers and mystics, there was a deeper level. And on that level, Tawhid expressed the idea that only God truly exists. That is to say, our individual selves, like who we are, right? Each one of us, we're subsumed inside God's being. We don't actually have any separate existence apart from Him. The goal of the mystical path is precisely the transformative realization of that very truth, which Bayezid expresses in a strikingly and intentionally provocative way. If only God exists, well then ipso facto, I myself am God. The origins of Sufism, right, which is a movement that came to be a dominant force in Islam right up until the modern day. Even the origins of the name Sufi itself are obscure. But Bayezid is undoubtedly one of the most important early Sufi figures. And in contrast to earlier Orientalist notions that saw Sufism as, well, something like exterior to Islam, something that came from outside Islam, a quote-unquote spiritual practice that was maybe more palatable to European sensibilities, scholars today rightly see Sufism as originating in the heart of Islam. As William Chittick, who's one of the leading scholars of Sufism today, has written, Sufism conceives of itself as the animating spirit of the Islamic tradition, a tradition that goes all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad, right? Prophet Muhammad is seen as the first Sufi. And some would argue that without this very animating spirit, Islam becomes only an empty and sterile set of rituals. In his seemingly radical words, Bayezid is, from a Sufi perspective, only expressing the deepest truth of the Prophet's revelation. Now, to me, what's interesting in this story, what's particularly interesting, is that Rumi cast Bayezid not in the role of spiritual master, that is not in the role that he actually plays in the Islamic tradition, but rather in the role of aspiring young seeker, traveling from town to town on his way to Mecca, and Bayezid did in fact go on the Hajj apparently during his lifetime. So in traveling, he looks for a local spiritual authority, right, to gain knowledge, to gain teaching. His encounter with the old man leads to his enlightenment. It leads to him becoming the Bayezid who we know from other sources, the Sufi master who inspired generations of mystics, not the least of whom was Rumi himself. When the old man says that he is not separate from God, right, that he is the perfect Kaaba, he's the perfect house for God, and that serving him is obeying God's decree, what he's doing is in fact echoing Bayezid's own statements, right? There's a kind of reversal here. Rumi is inviting us to consider how Bayezid became Bayezid, and I think, by extension, how Rumi's own readers might make that very same spiritual leap. Now, this perspective aligns with the larger goals of Rumi's work. Rumi was born in 1207 in Balkh in today's Afghanistan. Led by his father, a prominent scholar and Sufi himself, Rumi and his family fled west in the wake of the Mongol invasions of Central Asia. Eventually, in 1228, they settled in the town of Konya, in present-day Turkey. Rumi followed in his father's footsteps, practicing Sufism. He became a teacher and a judge. In other words, he found a respectable, sedate, intellectual, comfortable life. But it was an encounter in the year 1244 with the wandering ascetic Shamsi Tabrizi that entirely changed Rumi's life. We don't know very much about Shams for sure. Apparently, Shams spent 3 years with Rumi before suddenly leaving. Some versions of this story say that he was actually killed out of jealousy by Rumi's own son. Shams was erudite, he was deeply learned in Islam, but he was also an unrestrained, wild even, lover of God, and he had no patience with social or religious convention. Shams inspired Rumi, and the relationship between the two is captured in an often told story of their first meeting. So the story goes like this. Shams, looking, I imagine looking pretty scruffy, passes by Rumi as Rumi is sitting with his books open right in the marketplace, just studying. "What's all this?" Shams asks, ignorantly, it seems. And Rumi disdainfully answers him, "This is something that you can't understand, you ignoramus," right? Then, all of a sudden, The books spontaneously catch fire. And Rumi calls out, terrified, to Shams, "What's all this?" Shams calmly replies, "Something that you can't understand." So, catching fire, at least poetically catching fire, is certainly what happened to Rumi in the wake of this encounter. His poetic output is prodigious, including a collection of lyric poems dedicated to Shams and, of course, the Masnavi. Written in the latter half of Rumi's life, the Masnavi contains over 25,000 verses. It's revered as a work of literature and as a spiritual guide. Throughout the Persian-speaking world and beyond, Rumi, I read, is apparently the best-selling poet in the United States today. I'm sure the royalties are amazing. Throughout the poem's 6 books, Rumi gathers stories and anecdotes from numerous sources: Quran, literature about the life of the Prophet Muhammad and his sayings, fables, anecdotes, even dirty stories, dirty jokes, more. The poem is known as the Quran in Persian, in part because many of the Masnavi stories recast or allude to Quranic passages. In our story about Bayezid, I think that Rumi is likely playing with a number of such verses, including those discussing the establishment of the Kaaba as a shrine for all, those talking about Safa and Marwa, and he's also referencing the famous saying of the Prophet Muhammad, in which God is recorded as saying, "Neither my heavens nor my earth encompass me, but the heart of my believing servant does encompass me." Neither my heavens nor my earth, but the heart of my believing servant does encompass me. Indeed, as Rumi says in the introduction to the Masnavi, his goal here in the work as a whole is to uncover the roots of the roots of the roots of Islam. That's root 3 times. The Masnavi exposes the fundamental essence of the Quranic message, without being sidetracked by rituals or theological or legal nitpicking. And as for Bayezid, that essence is contained in the principle of Tawheed, divine oneness and unity. The realization of Tawheed, that there's truly none but God, that truly nothing exists but God, can only be achieved, Rumi says, through love. True love, like a flame, burns away everything else, not least of which is the self and ego of the lover. Book learning, the kind that Rumi, as well as Shams and Bayezid mastered, is essential. The disciplines of language, grammar, Quranic hermeneutics, dialectics are absolutely necessary preparations. But reason is not enough to take that final leap. Love, the kind of love that is aware that at the most basic level of reality, God is the only lover and the only beloved, only that can bring about the necessary realization. Love is both the means and the state in which the mind can grasp the self-negating truth of Tawheed. Now, if we consider our story again, I'll bring it back up on the screen for us to look at for a second. There we go. Now, what kind of love is there in this story? Right? And if we think about it from the perspective of the way we consider romantic love today, this doesn't seem like a very healthy relationship. Right? Bayezid is going off to Mecca. He has his own goals. He has his own self. And he encounters this old man who entirely overpowers him, entirely misdirects him, entirely denies the thing that he thought he wanted, changes his mind, changes his heart. You know, the way that we think about love and relationships today, at least for me, the two lovers are supposed to be equal partners coming at the relationship with, you know, their own paths and their own selves, and one isn't supposed to dominate and overpower the other. I mean, there's something that seems unhealthy that's going on here. Now, of course, that's not how Rumi thought about love. Our own historically contingent idea of love doesn't align with Rumi's. Rumi, and here I'm trying something else. I'll tell you in a sec what this is. Rumi was part of a discourse of love that was shared with other great Persian and Islamic poets. And a central part of those love stories is pain, denial, Romeo and Juliet, star-crossed lovers, right? Not a lack of consummation and certainly a lack of equality. The images we're seeing here are taken from two manuscripts, one 17th century on the left, one 18th century, both from the collections of the library, of the story, the version of the story of two lovers, Majnun and Layla. Majnun the crazy one, and here's Layla over here, by the great Persian poet Islamic. This entire story is one of Majnun falling in love with Layla, Layla being married off to someone else by her father, and Majnun essentially losing his mind over his love, pining for Layla, longing for her, writing poems on the sand dunes in the desert, because he misses her and wants her so much. And here in the image on the right, you can see Majnun as an aesthetic sitting with the wild animals, entirely having lost his mind. I'll just go back to me for a second here. Now, pain is an essential part of love. And pain, desire, and need are the true reality of our human situation. We're separate from God and long to return to Him, even if that longing is often directed because we are unaware of the true grounds of our existence, right? Towards physical and romantic love, the love of lovers. Acknowledging pain, in fact, is acknowledging the truth of our situation, and it leads to transformation. In recognizing the pain of love, we come to realize that we have nothing and we are nothing, in the true sense of Tawheed. Elsewhere in the Masnavi, Rumi writes that pain is an alchemy that renovates. Do not sigh coldly in your indifference. Seek pain, seek pain, seek pain. Now, before we turn to the next story, I just want to sum up maybe what this says about the Hajj, what Rumi says about the Hajj here. We might say that the relation between the physical pilgrimage, with all its rites and rituals, and the old man's invitation to Bayezid is kind of like the relation between romantic love and the Sufi love of self-annihilation in God, right? The idea of love and Tawheed. We can seek the Kaaba out there in the world, or we can do one better and realize that we ourselves are the Kaaba, that our heart is the best house God could ever choose. If that's the case, though, I think we have to ask ourselves, is there any point of going on the pilgrimage at all? More generally, if the path of love leads directly to enlightenment, and that's what Rumi, to me, I think is implying in this story, why follow the religious laws and rituals generally? Why adhere to the religion? Why follow the code? I think our second story, which we can turn to now, can help provide an answer. So, the second story comes from another famous scholar and philosopher and mystic, an older contemporary of Rumi, perhaps also an influence on him, though we can set that aside for a different discussion. His name was Muhammad ibn Arabi, known as Al-Sheikh Al-Akbar, the greatest master. He was born in Murcia in Muslim Spain, Muslim Al-Andalus, in 1165. At the tender age of 16, Ibn Arabi had his first mystical vision of Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, the three monotheistic prophets all together, and it was the first of many that he would have over the course of his life. After embarking on his spiritual training, including instruction in the traditional areas of Islamic knowledge, of course, Ibn Arabi left Spain for North Africa. In 1193, began his writing career, and over the course of his life, he would write an astonishing 400 or more books. In 1200, Ibn Arabi embarked on the Hajj, and he stayed in Mecca for 3 years. While there, he began writing one of his most famous, and certainly one of his most complex works, the 37-volume Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan openings, or the Meccan Revelations. After leaving Mecca, he eventually moved on to Damascus, and where he continued writing and gathering students. As an interesting aside, apparently one of those students was the very same Shams Tabrizi who inspired Rumi. Ibn Arabi died in 1240. Now, the Futuhat, which contains the second story that I want to talk about, it's an expansive book. It's a wide-ranging book, written over the course of 20 years, and it touches on a host of topics from the Quran to psychology, the true meaning of Islamic rituals, cosmology, other stuff. The book is also suffused, it's full of records of Ibn Arabi's own visions. And it's one of those visions that I want to talk about. So in chapter 72 of the Futuhat, which is dedicated specifically to the mysteries, the secrets of the pilgrimage, right, the Hajj, Ibn Arabi describes his relationship with the Kaaba, okay, and what later led him to write a series of love letters to the Kaaba, to the building itself, okay, love letters to the building, known as the Crown of Epistles and the Path to Intercessions. So he writes, the fact was, I considered my constitution to be more excellent than that of the Kaaba, right? I thought I was better than the Kaaba, and that as a place of theophany, of divine realities, it was inferior to me. In other words, Ibn Arabi saw himself, just like the old man in Rumi's story, as a more worthy house for God's glory than the Kaaba made only of stone. Why does a mere physical structure, a mineral constitution, he called it, compare with the heart of a human being who has realized his oneness with God? And then one night, Ibn Arabi continues, and here I want to show you the text and share it with you. So we're going to go back and forth here. Okay. One night, he incited me to rise from my bed one cool night with a full moon and a slight dew. I did my ablutions and went out to accomplish the ritual circuits, profoundly disturbed. It seemed to me that just one person was carrying out the circuits. I began by kissing the stone and then started to circumambulate. Having arrived at the gutter, the particular place right in the compound, I looked at the Kaaba. I then saw it as perceived by the faculty of my imagination, raise the skirts of its robe and maintain itself thus hovering above its foundations. It had the intention of turning me back when I reached the Syrian corner, right? It was just another location, doesn't matter really where it is, to prevent me from circling around it. It threatened me, using words which my ears could hear. I felt deeply afflicted on account of this. And for his part, God displayed to me such irritation and fury that I was unable to move from where I was standing. I sheltered behind the enclosure to fend off its blows and took hold of it as a shield. By God, I heard it being the Kaaba here, right, saying to me, keep coming on and we'll see what I will do with you. How you underestimate my value and overestimate that of the sons of Adam. And consider that those who have knowledge are superior to me. By the almighty power of him alone to whom it belongs, I shall not allow you to circle around me. I came back to my senses and realized that God wished to correct me. I thanked him for this, and the affliction which I felt vanished. As for the Kaaba, it seemed to be hovering above the ground, lifting the skirts of its robe like one who pulls up his clothes before jumping. I had the impression that it had gathered up its veils, ready to jump on me. It had taken the form of a young girl, such as I had never seen, and of a beauty that cannot even be imagined. On the spur of the moment, I improvised some verses, which I addressed to it, in order to calm its irritation towards me. Gradually, as I began to praise it with these words, it grew bigger, it fell back onto its foundations. It displayed its satisfaction at what I was reciting it until it returned to its initial state. Now, there's a number of really interesting points here, as in the Rumi story, and I want to sort of discuss them in turn. I'll just leave this up here on the screen for a minute. So Ibn Arabi's vision, right, to summarize, is of a Kaaba suddenly alive, giant and powerful, threatening and beautiful, even seductive, right? Having dismissed the Kaaba as insignificant in comparison to his own illuminated being, Ibn Arabi experiences the Kaaba as revenge, right? Floating above its foundations, the Kaaba threatens to destroy him and prevent his ritual circumambulation. How dare you consider yourself more important than me, the Kaaba asks. Now come and see exactly how much importance and power I have. Now, Ibn Arabi immediately realizes he's wrong, and once he sort of proclaims this impromptu love poem, the Kaaba's rage quiets and it goes back down onto its foundations. There's a lot here to discuss, and there's a much richer story than we can get into, certainly in the time that remains. I think the main point I want to discuss here, and here maybe I'll move to the screen. The main point I want to discuss here concerns love, because this is also a love story, if not a standard one. Ibn Arabi comes to the Kaaba at night, alone, by the light of the moon. I mean, the whole setting is like a romantic rendezvous. Rather than being embraced by his lover, though, the Kaaba, is angry at not being taken seriously and not being valued. When Ibn Arabi realizes he's in the wrong, that's when the Kaaba's femininity expresses itself most clearly. And this inspires him to compose the poem, right? Ibn Arabi is then cast in the role of something like the crazed lover Majnun, whom we mentioned only a few minutes ago, writing poems for his Layla. Only this expression of love finally calms the beloved's tempestuous spirits. Here, I'll just go back to me. So, what kind of love story is this anyway? I think, much like the story by Yazid in The Old Man, this love involves a large dose of pain and ends in illumination. However, Ibn Arabi doesn't arrive at the dissolution of the self in the love of God and supplanting of the physical Kaaba in Mecca by the Kaaba of the heart. On the contrary, love inspires Ibn Arabi to realize the necessity of precisely the physical Kaaba and to be humbled before it. For Ibn Arabi, the Kaaba and the Hajj are part of a symbolic system. The physical structure in Mecca represents the heart, right, where the self and God truly reside. And the physical Kaaba demands respect, as Ibn Arabi terrifyingly learned, precisely because coming face to face with the Kaaba is coming face to face with the self, the most clarified self that is a locus for the manifestation of the divine. The rituals of the Hajj are a tool for achieving this revelation. And the geography, the map, the sites of the sacred city are kind of a guide pointing toward it. The Kaaba, because it is God's chosen house, is a place of illumination and visions. And for Ibn Arabi, the story serves to reassert the centrality of the physical structure in Mecca, the Kaaba itself, over and above the author's own self-aggrandizing dismissal of it. Ibn Arabi, I think, in a way that Rumi does not, he succeeds in holding in tension these two, not contrary, but complementary positions. That the physical Kaaba is God's chosen house, and that the true Kaaba is the Kaaba of the heart. So that brings me to the end of the stories for today, and I want to say thank you again for your attention and your patience. To me, the central takeaway of both these tales is really one of the richness and depth of the Hajj itself, especially for non-Muslims looking from the outside. And since Muslims can't go to Mecca, we can only look from the outside in a way. The Hajj can well seem so strange and foreign, impenetrable and inaccessible. But I think these stories give us a glimpse, though, of the symbolic depth and richness of this experience for believers in the past, right, in the Middle Ages, and also today. There are other levels of the Hajj, other echoes, other reframings that we could have considered and which we could still compare with these and other stories. What I like most about Rumi and Ibn Arabi, at least the tales that we've talked about today, is that we can take their lessons home with us. We can take their lessons home with us in the Kaaba of our own hearts. So thank you so much, and for your time, for your attention, for staying, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. There are a few questions. First is there a difference between the ritual at the Kaaba between Sufis and regular Muslims? And also, has that ritual changed over the years, as far as you know? As
far as I know, there's no difference between how Sufis and others practice the ritual of walking around the Kaaba, circumambulating the Kaaba, or any of the other Hajj rituals. They are extremely ancient and they haven't changed over time. Apart from the innovations of having 2.5 million pilgrims come to Mecca every year, which does logistically affect things. That being said, Sunni and Shia Muslims, which is a very different topic, obviously, they do things a little bit differently. For instance, Shia Muslims, right, who are the majority in Iran, parts of Central Asia, Lebanon, Shia women also wear white garments, whereas Sunni women going on Hajj just wear their regular clothes, and only Sunni men wear white.
Thank you very much. Lana has a question. What is Maktoub?
What is Maktoub? Literally, Maktoub is something that's written, but right from, if you're familiar with Hebrew, it's the same root as katav, kotev, ani kotev, hakatuv, right? What is written. Maktoub is a project, as I said at the beginning, is a new, just launched project of the National Library of Israel to digitize our entire Islamic manuscript collection. As part of my work on the project, I'm finding stories about the manuscripts, some of which were sort of woven into the talk today, and there are more stories on the blog of the library website for you to explore and to read. And at the end of the project, there's going to be a website dedicated to the library's Islamic manuscript collection in Persian, Arabic, and Turkish that everyone from around the world can explore, download, do research. It's a really, really exciting thing.
Thank you very much. Alan asks, what is the connection between the Kaaba, Muhammad, and Allah?
Well, I mean, there's a deep connection between all three. The Kaaba is, within the Islamic tradition, the earliest idea of the Kaaba is that it was actually created in heaven and sent down to earth by the angel Gabriel, right, and established there. And the black stone, which is fixed into one of the corners of the Kaaba, is said to be from heaven as well. The Kaaba plays a role in Islam that is kind of, I don't want to stretch this too far, but it's kind of parallel to the role, for those who are familiar, to the temple in Judaism, right? The temple in Jerusalem in ancient Judaism, where that is actually the place where God lives, in a way. It's the holiest site in Islam. And in antiquity, there were other similar structures, other similar Kaabas all around Saudi Arabia, or the Arabian Peninsula and elsewhere. And there's been some archaeological research on that, actually. And Muhammad's relationship to the Kaaba is one of someone who grew up in Mecca. He was born in the city and spent his life as a merchant up until his first revelation. And even at that time, in the 7th century, Mecca was a pilgrimage center where people would come to the Kaaba, they'd come to pray, they'd come to give offerings, they'd come to seek good fortune. And so Muhammad's life was entirely wrapped up in and wrapped around the centrality of the Kaaba in Mecca. That's why the direction of prayer precisely is towards Mecca, because of the Kaaba. I mean, there's a lot to say, but I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. I can't pronounce the name, I'm sorry. I think it's Vishwishar. I hope I didn't destroy that. They ask, what is Kaaba? Why is it covered by cloth? And what's inside it?
Okay, so Kaaba, as we said, is the building in the center of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. The black cloth that covers the Kaaba is called the kiswa. and it's embroidered silk, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, it's a good question why there's a covering on it. I don't know. I would have to do some research on that, but I do know that the covering dates back at least to the Middle Ages, if not before. Every year during the pilgrimage, there was a particular family in Cairo who would weave a new covering for the Kaaba, a new kiswa every year. It would come with the pilgrims when they made their way to Mecca for the Hajj and replace the old one. And as for what's inside the Kaaba, if you look, actually, there's an interesting video, I think, yeah, it must be a video on YouTube recently, from a few years ago when they opened up the Kaaba to do some repairs inside, right? It's not, you can go inside, people generally don't, but it is possible to. And there's a video which just shows the different things that are inside. There's a place on the floor which shows where Muhammad prayed inside the Kaaba one time. There's particular, let's see what I remember from the video, there's particular inscriptions on the walls from various periods of repairs to the building, if I'm not mistaken. But if you search for it, you can find it. And it's actually really fascinating, right? Because when we, or anyone really, most Muslims, like the vast majority of Muslims, imagine the Kaaba, they imagine it from the outside. But there's also an inside. That's a really interesting question.
Thank you very much. Abdullah asks, do you know of any Sufis who use the Quran as an explicit source to suggest the Kaaba is a symbol of the heart? Or do they only use philosophical or spiritual interpretations to arrive to that meaning?
No. So that's a very good question. And the answer is yes, and I don't have a specific source in mind, but it is absolutely yes, because both Rumi and Ibn Arabi, even more so, more explicitly, are of course weaving together and drawing on their vast knowledge of Quran and Hadith to make their points and to justify the sort of mystical interpretations that they're offering. I mean, I think one major source is the Hadith I quoted earlier. Let me just find it for you if I can quickly. It's the Hadith where the Prophet says that, God says that the best house for me. Wait, just give me a second. Let's see if I can find it. Neither my heavens nor my earth encompass me, but the heart of my believing servant does encompass me. I think that hadith is one of the major sources. And as for the Quran, I'd have to double check, but they're certainly and absolutely, I can say, in conversation with the Quranic sources.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great night.
Have a pleasant evening, everyone. Thank you very much.